The sound of his daughter's sobs pierced through the mahogany doors of his corner office like a knife through silk. Marcus Wellington froze mid-sentence during his conference call with Tokyo investors, his Mont Blanc pen hovering over quarterly projections. 8-year-old Sophie's voice cracked with the kind of raw pain that only a child's heart could produce, each word a dagger aimed straight at his chest. "Daddy, why don't you love me? Why are you always too busy for me?" The silence that followed was deafening, broken only by the muffled sound of gentle consolation from someone else. Marcus's hand trembled as he reached for the mute button, his billion-dollar empire suddenly feeling as fragile as his daughter's breaking heart. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. Marcus Wellington had built his pharmaceutical empire from nothing, transforming a small research lab inherited from his late father into Wellington Industries, a global powerhouse worth $3 billion. At 38, he commanded respect. In boardrooms from Manhattan to Mumbai, his sharp intellect and ruthless business acumen legendary among Fortune 500 executives. His penthouse office on the 62nd floor of the Wellington Tower offered a breathtaking view of Chicago's skyline, floor-to-ceiling windows reflecting his success back at him in gleaming steel and glass. Yet as he stood there listening to his daughter's heartbreak echo through the hallway, all his achievements felt hollow. The voice that answered Sophie belonged to Elena Rodriguez, the nanny he'd hired 6 months ago after the previous caregiver quit without notice. Unlike the parade of stern British women and overly cheerful college graduates who'd preceded her, Elena possessed a quiet strength that had immediately put Sophie at ease. She was 28, with warm brown eyes that seemed to see straight through people's carefully constructed facades, and a gentle manner that somehow commanded respect without demanding it. Marcus had hired her primarily because of her impressive credentials, a master's degree in child psychology from Northwestern, and 5 years of experience with high-profile families. What he hadn't anticipated was how her presence would begin to illuminate the emotional wasteland he'd created in his own home. "Sophie, mi amor, your daddy loves you very much." Elena's voice drifted through the door, soft but certain. Sometimes grown-ups get so focused on providing for their families that they forget the most important thing their children need isn't money or big houses, but their time and attention. Marcus pressed his ear closer to the door, something tightening in his chest. "But why doesn't he ever come to my school plays? Why doesn't he read me bedtime stories anymore? Sarah's daddy takes her to the park every Saturday, and Emma's dad helps her with homework." Sophie's voice was small, defeated in a way that made Marcus's successful mornings suddenly taste bitter. Elena's response came with the patience of someone who truly understood children's hearts. "You know what I think? I think your daddy has forgotten how to show love because he's been hurt before too. When people lose someone they care about very much, sometimes they put up walls to protect themselves, even from the people they love most." There was a pause, and Marcus could picture Elena smoothing Sophie's dark curls, the same gesture he'd once done naturally, but now felt foreign to his hands. But walls can come down, especially when someone as special as you shows them it's safe to love again. The conversation that followed would haunt Marcus for days. Sophie asked why her mommy had to die, why daddy worked all the time now, and whether she was a bad daughter for wanting more attention. Elena answered each question with a wisdom that bypassed psychology textbooks and went straight to the truth. She told Sophie about how grief could make people freeze up inside, how some daddies showed love by working hard to keep their children safe, and how sometimes the people who needed love most were the ones who seemed to push it away. As Marcus listened, he realized Elena wasn't just comforting his daughter. She was performing surgery on wounds he'd refused to acknowledge existed. The tragedy that had reshaped their family had occurred 2 years earlier when Sophie was just 6. Victoria Wellington, Marcus's wife of 10 years, had been driving home from Sophie's dance recital when a drunk driver ran a red light. The impact killed her instantly, leaving Marcus to raise their daughter alone while grappling with grief so profound it threatened to swallow him whole. In those first months, he'd thrown himself into work with desperate intensity, using 18-hour days and international business trips as shields against the empty spaces Victoria had once filled. Somewhere in his quest to build financial security for Sophie's future, he'd forgotten that she needed a father in her present. Elena had arrived during one of Marcus's darkest periods, when he'd been cycling through nannies like seasonal employees. Sophie had grown increasingly withdrawn, her bright personality dimming with each caregiver who treated her more like a responsibility than a person. The school had begun calling about behavioral issues, missed parent conferences, and Sophie's declining academic performance. It was his assistant, Patricia, who'd finally intervened, placing Elena's resume on his desk with a sticky note that read, "This one is different. Interview her." Marcus had been skeptical, expecting another candidate who saw dollar signs instead of his daughter's needs. The interview had taken place on a rainy Thursday evening in his home office, mahogany bookshelves lined with business journals and empty picture frames that once held family photos. Elena had arrived precisely on time, dressed professionally, but not pretentiously, carrying a small bag that would later prove to contain art supplies and children's books. Unlike previous candidates who'd focused on their credentials and salary expectations, Elena had asked about Sophie's interests, her routine, her favorite foods, and her relationship with her father. When Marcus had curtly explained that he traveled frequently and worked long hours, Elena had simply nodded and asked what Sophie did when she missed him. The question had caught him off guard because it implied Sophie actually did miss him, something he'd begun to doubt. "She draws pictures sometimes," he'd answered, remembering the crayon drawings that appeared on his desk occasionally, usually featuring stick figures labeled Daddy and Sophie holding hands under rainbow skies. "And she waits by the window when you're coming home," Elena had observed gently. "Children always wait for their parents, Mr. Wellington, even when they're not sure their parents are coming back." The statement had hit him like a physical blow, the truth of it reverberating through defenses he hadn't realized he'd constructed. Elena's references had been impeccable, but what had ultimately convinced Marcus to hire her was a simple moment during their conversation. Sophie had wandered into the office, still in her school uniform, clutching a stuffed elephant named Mr. Peanuts. Instead of the awkward adult baby talk most caregivers employed, Elena had crouched to Sophie's eye level and commented on the elephant's thoughtful expression. "He looks like he's very good at keeping secrets," she'd said seriously. Sophie had immediately brightened, launching into an elaborate story about Mr. Peanut's adventures, while Elena listened with genuine interest. For the first time in months, Marcus had seen his daughter's eyes truly light up. The first few weeks of Elena's employment had been revelatory in ways Marcus hadn't expected. She'd arrived each morning at 7:30, prepared healthy breakfasts that Sophie actually ate, and somehow managed to get her ready for school without the usual battles over clothing and hairstyles. When Marcus emerged from his bedroom already dressed for the office, phone in hand.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story.
And mind on the day's first meeting, he'd find Sophie laughing at the kitchen table over some story Elena was telling about her childhood in Mexico. The ease between them had made him feel like an intruder in his own home, a stranger observing. A warmth he'd forgotten how to create. Elena's approach to childcare differed dramatically from her predecessors. While previous nannies had focused on schedules and academic achievement, Elena seemed to understand that Sophie's behavioral issues stemmed from emotional neglect rather than lack of discipline. She'd implemented what she called connection time, 30 minutes each afternoon dedicated to whatever Sophie wanted to do, whether that was painting, playing dress-up, or simply talking about her day. Marcus would occasionally glimpse these sessions from his office doorway, watching Elena give Sophie the kind of focused attention he'd once provided naturally, but now struggled to remember how to offer. The changes in Sophie had been gradual, but unmistakable. Her teachers reported improved behavior, and renewed enthusiasm for learning. She'd started bringing home artwork again, proudly displaying her creations on the refrigerator with Elena's encouragement. Her nightmares, which had plagued her since Victoria's death, became less frequent, and she'd begun sleeping through the night more consistently. Most remarkably, she'd started talking about her mother again, something she'd stopped doing entirely. In the months before Elena's arrival, under Elena's gentle guidance, Sophie was learning to process her grief instead of burying it, a lesson her father desperately needed to learn himself. Yet despite these positive changes, Marcus found himself feeling increasingly displaced in his own family. Elena's natural competence highlighted his own deficiencies as a father, her easy connection with Sophie emphasizing the distance that had grown between him and his daughter. He'd catch moments of their laughter from his office and feel simultaneously grateful and excluded, appreciating Elena's positive influence, while wrestling with the knowledge that a stranger was providing the emotional support his daughter needed. It was a dynamic that both solved his immediate childcare needs and deepened his sense of isolation, creating a complex web of dependence and resentment that he struggled to untangle. The morning routine had become a carefully choreographed dance that allowed Marcus to avoid meaningful interaction while maintaining the illusion of family connection. He'd emerge from his bedroom at 7:15, shower quickly, and dress in one of his dozen identical navy suits while Elena prepared breakfast and helped Sophie get ready for school. By the time he reached the kitchen, Sophie would be finishing her meal, backpack ready, permission slips signed by Elena, and lunch packed with the kind of attention to detail that spoke of genuine care. Marcus would kiss Sophie's forehead perfunctorily, grab his coffee, and head for the elevator, usually fielding the first business call of the day before he'd even left the building. This particular morning had started no differently from dozens of others, Marcus's attention already consumed by the quarterly board meeting scheduled for 10 o'clock. Wellington Industries was on the verge of launching a new arthritis medication that could revolutionize treatment for millions of patients worldwide, and the presentation to investors required his complete focus. He'd spent the previous evening reviewing clinical trial data and financial projections, the kind of detailed preparation that had made him one of the pharmaceutical industry's most respected executives. As he dressed that morning, his mind was already in the boardroom, anticipating questions about market penetration and manufacturing scalability. Sophie had been unusually quiet during breakfast, pushing scrambled eggs around her plate while Elena gently encouraged her to eat. "You need energy for your spelling test today, remember?" Elena had said, her voice carrying the warm authority that seemed to motivate Sophie in ways Marcus's more direct approaches never achieved. But Sophie had just nodded listlessly, her usual morning chatter replaced by an uncharacteristic melancholy that Marcus, absorbed in reading emails on his phone, had failed to notice. It was Elena who'd caught his attention with a meaningful look, her raised eyebrows suggesting he should engage with his daughter's obvious distress. "Everything okay, sweetheart?" Marcus had asked, his tone distracted, eyes still scanning his phone screen. Sophie had looked up hopefully, as if his simple question might open a door to deeper conversation, but when his phone immediately buzzed with another message, she'd watched his attention shift away again. "It's nothing, Daddy," she'd said quietly, and Marcus had nodded, already reading the next email. Elena had watched this exchange with the kind of professional observation that missed nothing, her expression carefully neutral, but her dark eyes reflecting an understanding that made Marcus momentarily uncomfortable. The drive to Sophie's school was a 10-minute journey through Chicago's affluent Lincoln Park neighborhood, tree-lined streets giving way to the prestigious Pemberton Academy's campus. Marcus typically used this time for phone calls, his Bluetooth earpiece allowing him to conduct business, while Elena handled the actual interaction with Sophie in the back seat. Today had been no different, his conversation with the head of international sales consuming his attention while Elena helped Sophie organize her backpack and offered last-minute encouragement about the spelling test. As they'd pulled up to the circular drive where other parents were walking their children to the entrance, Marcus had ended his call just long enough to say goodbye. "Have a good day, Sophie," he'd said, already reaching for his phone to return the call he'd missed. Sophie had lingered by his window, clearly wanting something more than his distracted farewell, but when Marcus had simply waved and begun dialing, she'd walked slowly toward the school entrance with Elena beside her. Through his rearview mirror, Marcus had watched other fathers crouching down to hug their children goodbye, some carrying forgotten lunchboxes or art projects, others simply taking a moment to connect before beginning their own workdays. He'd felt a brief pang of something, guilt or recognition, but his ringing phone had quickly reclaimed his attention. The boardroom on the 61st floor had been Marcus's sanctuary for the past decade, a place where his analytical mind could solve complex problems through data and strategic thinking. The mahogany conference table could seat 20 executives, its surface polished to mirror brightness, surrounded by leather chairs that had hosted negotiations worth billions of dollars. Today's presentation required his complete focus slides, depicting market research and competitive analysis that would determine Wellington Industries' next chapter. As investors filed in, Marcus felt the familiar surge of confidence that came from being completely prepared, his element where uncertainty could be managed through thorough planning and decisive action. The presentation had been proceeding flawlessly, Marcus's command of the material evident in every answer to investor questions. He detailed the new medication's advantages over existing treatments, outlined the marketing strategy that would capture significant market share, and projected revenues that would cement Wellington Industries' position as an industry leader. His assistant Patricia had been monitoring calls and messages, ensuring nothing interrupted the crucial meeting, which made the soft knock on the boardroom door all the more surprising. Patricia never interrupted presentations unless something truly urgent demanded his attention. Elena stood in the doorway, her professional composure intact, but her eyes reflecting an urgency that immediately commanded Marcus's attention. She wore a simple navy dress that suggested she'd dressed quickly, her usually perfect hair slightly disheveled in a way that indicated genuine concern, rather than casual interruption. "Mr. Wellington, I'm sorry to interrupt, but there's been an incident at Sophie's school," she said quietly, her voice carrying just enough volume to reach him without disrupting the entire meeting. The words hit Marcus like ice water, his carefully constructed presentation suddenly feeling insignificant compared to his daughter's well-being. The drive to Pemberton Academy passed in a blur of Elena's explanation and Marcus's growing dread. Sophie had apparently suffered what the school counselor termed an emotional breakdown during lunch, becoming inconsolable when other children had discussed their upcoming father-daughter dance. The annual event, scheduled for the following Friday, required each girl to attend with her father or father figure, and Sophie's distress had escalated. When she'd realized her daddy would probably be too busy to attend, her tears had attracted other children's attention, and when one girl had thoughtlessly commented that maybe Sophie's daddy didn't love her as much as their daddies loved them, Sophie had run from the cafeteria in tears. Elena had received the call from the school nurse, who'd found Sophie hiding in the bathroom, sobbing uncontrollably and asking why her daddy didn't want to spend time with her. The nurse had managed to calm Sophie temporarily, but her requests to call her father had been met with the standard response that he was in important meetings and couldn't be disturbed. It was only when Sophie had asked for Elena specifically, saying she was the only one who really understood her feelings, that the school had agreed to contact the nanny instead of continuing to leave voicemails for Marcus. The fact that his 8-year-old daughter had learned not to expect her father's availability during school emergencies was a reality that struck Marcus with devastating clarity. Pemberton Academy's counseling office felt too small for the conversation that awaited them, child-sized furniture and colorful motivational posters creating an incongruous backdrop for the emotional crisis at hand. Sophie sat curled in an oversized beanbag chair, Mr. Peanuts clutched against her chest, her face red and puffy from crying. When Marcus entered the room, she looked up with a mixture of hope and skepticism, as if his presence might be a dream that would disappear if she acknowledged it too directly. Elena immediately went to Sophie's side, her presence seeming to provide the stability that allowed Sophie to remain calm enough for conversation. Mrs. Henderson, the school counselor, was a woman in her 50s whose gentle manner couldn't quite mask her concern about the situation she was witnessing. Sophie has been struggling with some big feelings today, she explained to Marcus, her tone professionally kind but pointed. She's been asking some difficult questions about feeling loved and valued, and I think she needs some reassurance from the most important person in her life. The words were diplomatic, but Marcus heard the underlying message clearly. His daughter was emotionally starving, and everyone in the room except him seemed to understand the source of her hunger. The conversation that followed would replay in Marcus's mind for weeks afterward, each word a small knife cutting through the defenses he'd built around his heart. Sophie, encouraged by Elena's presence and Mrs. Henderson's gentle questions, began to articulate feelings she'd apparently been carrying for months. She talked about watching other children's fathers attend school events while hers was always too busy, about drawing pictures that went unnoticed on his desk, about bedtime stories that had stopped happening because Daddy was always working. Her words came in halting bursts, interrupted by fresh tears, but her message was devastatingly clear. She felt invisible to the person whose attention mattered most. "I know Daddy loves me," Sophie said, her voice small but determined to be fair. "But he loves his work more. Elena says he works hard to take care of me, but I just want him to want to be with me sometimes." The statement was delivered without anger or accusation, just the kind of heartbreaking acceptance that children develop when their emotional needs consistently go unmet. Marcus felt something crack inside his chest, the careful compartmentalization that had allowed him to function. Since Victoria's death, suddenly feeling inadequate against his daughter's simple truth. Elena's role in the conversation was subtle but crucial, providing the emotional support that allowed Sophie to express herself while creating space for Marcus to truly hear what his daughter was saying. She didn't speak for Sophie or interpret her feelings, but her presence seemed to give both father and daughter permission to be vulnerable in ways they'd forgotten how to access. When Sophie mentioned the father-daughter dance, her voice dropping to a whisper as she explained she'd told her friends her daddy probably couldn't come, Elena gently encouraged her to tell him directly what she wanted instead of assuming the answer. "Would you like Daddy to come to the dance with you?" Elena asked softly, her hand resting supportively on Sophie's shoulder. Sophie nodded, then looked directly at her father with an expression that held both hope and practiced disappointment. "But he has important meetings," she said, unconsciously echoing the phrase she'd heard countless times. "He always has important meetings." The resignation in her voice was what finally shattered Marcus's carefully maintained composure. The realization that his 8-year-old daughter had learned to expect abandonment from the person who should be her greatest source of security. Marcus looked at his daughter, really looked at her, perhaps for the first time in months. She seemed smaller than he remembered, her school uniform hanging loose on her thin frame, dark circles under her eyes suggesting the kind of stress no child should carry. Her resemblance to Victoria was striking, the same intelligent dark eyes and determined chin, but where Victoria had radiated confidence and joy, Sophie seemed diminished, as if she'd learned to take up less space to accommodate her father's busy schedule. The recognition hit him like a physical blow, the understanding that he'd been so focused on protecting Sophie's future that he'd been neglecting her present, starving her of the emotional connection that was as essential as food or shelter. The drive home was conducted in thoughtful silence, Elena somehow understanding that both Marcus and Sophie needed time to process what had happened. Sophie sat in her booster seat, still clutching Mr. Peanuts, occasionally glancing at her father. Through the rearview mirror, as if trying to determine whether this moment of attention would last or fade away like so many others. Marcus found himself studying his daughter's reflection, noticing details he'd missed in his daily rush toward productivity. When had she lost so much weight? When had her bright chatter been replaced by this careful quietness? When had she learned to expect so little from him that his presence at a school crisis felt like an unexpected gift? Elena's apartment building stood in stark contrast to the Wellington penthouse, a modest brick structure in a neighborhood where families actually seemed to know each other's names. As they'd driven past playgrounds and corner cafes, Marcus had realized he knew almost nothing about Elena's life outside his employment, her interests, her background, or the experiences that had shaped her remarkable ability to connect with children. She'd mentioned having family in Mexico, a degree from Northwestern, but the details of her personal story remained largely mysterious, another indication of how he'd maintained professional distance even with someone who'd become central to his daughter's well-being. That evening, Marcus canceled his dinner meeting with potential investors from Germany, sending his assistant Patricia home early and ordering takeout from Sophie's favorite Italian restaurant instead. The decision felt monumental, the first time in 2 years he'd prioritized family time over business obligations, and he wasn't entirely sure how to navigate the unfamiliar territory of being present for his daughter. Elena had offered to stay and help with dinner, but Marcus had declined, recognizing that he needed to learn how to connect with Sophie without an interpreter, even if the prospect felt intimidating. After months of emotional distance, dinner together revealed how much he'd missed during his self-imposed exile from family life. Sophie talked about her best friend Emma, her favorite teacher Mrs. Rodriguez, who reminded her of Elena, and her latest reading assignment about a girl who befriended a dragon. Her conversation was peppered with references to movies he'd never heard of, books Elena had been reading to her, and school friends whose names were completely unfamiliar. Marcus realized with growing shame that Elena probably knew more about his daughter's daily life than he did. A stranger had become Sophie's primary source of emotional support, while her actual father had retreated into professional obligations. As bedtime approached, Sophie asked tentatively if Daddy might read her a story, the question delivered with the kind of careful hope that suggested she'd learned not to expect positive responses to such requests. Marcus found himself in Sophie's bedroom for the first time in weeks, surrounded by artwork he'd never seen, stuffed animals he didn't recognize, and evidence of interest that had developed entirely outside his awareness. The book Sophie chose was one Elena had been reading to her, a story about a little girl who felt invisible until someone finally took the time to really see her. As Marcus read, he couldn't escape the parallels between the fictional character and his own daughter's experience. The bedtime routine that followed felt both foreign and achingly familiar, muscle memory from Sophie's early years when he'd been a hands-on father who'd never missed goodnight kisses or weekend adventures. Sophie's delight at his attention was heartbreaking in its intensity, her joy at having his undivided focus for 30 minutes revealing how starved she'd become for paternal connection. As he tucked her in and turned off the lights, Sophie's sleepy voice followed him toward the door. "Daddy, will you still be here in the morning?" The question contained multitudes, asking not just about his physical presence, but whether this moment of attention was sustainable or another false promise. Marcus spent that night in his home office, not working for the first time in recent memory, but looking through photo albums he'd packed away after Victoria's death. The pictures told the story of the father he'd once been, images of family, vacations, birthday parties, and quiet moments that demonstrated his complete engagement with his wife and daughter. In photo after photo, he saw evidence of the connection he'd severed, the joy he'd abandoned. The man he'd been before grief had convinced him that emotional distance was safer than vulnerability. Somewhere between Victoria's funeral and the present day, he'd decided that being a good provider was sufficient, that financial security could substitute for emotional presence. The revelation that would change everything came the following morning, not through dramatic confrontation, but through a quiet moment of observation that penetrated his defenses more effectively than any argument could have achieved. Marcus had awakened early, his internal clocks still programmed for dawn conference calls and pre-market briefings, but instead of immediately reaching for his phone, he'd found himself drawn toward the kitchen by the sound of gentle conversation. Elena and Sophie were making pancakes together, their easy interaction creating the kind of domestic warmth that had been absent from the house since Victoria's death. Standing unnoticed in the doorway, Marcus watched Elena teach Sophie how to flip pancakes, their laughter mixing with the scent of vanilla and cinnamon in a way that made the house feel like a home again. Elena's patience was infinite, her encouragement genuine, and her ability to find joy in simple moments something Marcus had forgotten was possible. Sophie glowed under this attention, her personality bright and confident in ways that reminded Marcus painfully of the child she'd been before he'd retreated into emotional hibernation. The scene was everything he'd once taken for granted, the kind of family connection he'd convinced himself was a luxury his busy schedule couldn't accommodate. But it was Elena's words, spoken softly to Sophie as they worked together, that finally broke through the walls Marcus had constructed around his heart. You know what makes pancakes perfect, mi amor? It's not the recipe or the technique. It's making them with love, taking time to do something special for people who matter to you. Sophie had nodded seriously, then asked if that was why Elena's pancakes always tasted better than the ones from restaurants. Exactly, Elena had replied. When you put love into what you do, people can taste it, feel it. That's what makes ordinary moments extraordinary. The metaphor was gentle but devastating in its accuracy, highlighting everything Marcus had been withholding from his daughter in his quest to provide for her material needs. He'd been offering Sophie the equivalent of restaurant pancakes, technically adequate but lacking the essential ingredient that would nourish her heart. Elena wasn't just making breakfast, she was creating memories, building connections, and demonstrating the kind of love that required presence rather than presents. The contrast between Elena's emotional generosity and his own emotional absence was so stark it took his breath away. Marcus retreated to his office before they could notice his observation, but Elena's words echoed in his mind as he attempted to focus on the day's obligations. Every email felt trivial compared to the realization that his daughter was thriving under another person's care while withering under his neglect. The quarterly reports that had seemed crucial yesterday now felt like elaborate distractions from the real work he needed to do, the rebuilding of a relationship he'd nearly destroyed through benign indifference. For the first time since Victoria's death, Marcus questioned whether his relentless focus on professional success was actually serving his daughter's best interests. The father-daughter dance loomed as both opportunity and test, a chance to demonstrate that he'd heard Sophie's plea for connection while simultaneously confronting his own discomfort with public displays of emotion. Marcus had attended such events in the past, during the years when family life had felt natural and uncomplicated, but the prospect of navigating Sophie's vulnerable hope while managing his own grief felt overwhelming. He knew Sophie would be watching for signs that this attention was temporary, that he might revert to his previous pattern of promises broken by professional obligations. The stakes felt impossibly high, his daughter's faith and his love hanging in the balance. Elena's perspective on the situation emerged during a conversation that Marcus hadn't planned but found himself needing. He'd approached her during Sophie's afternoon quiet time, ostensibly to discuss logistics for the dance, but actually seeking guidance from someone who understood his daughter better than he did. Elena's response was characteristically direct but kind, her insight cutting through his uncertainty with the kind of clarity that had made her invaluable to their family. Sophie doesn't need a perfect father, Mr. Wellington, she said gently. She needs a present one. The dance isn't about proving you can be the dad you used to be. It's about choosing to be the dad she needs you to be now. The conversation that followed was the longest personal discussion Marcus had ever had with Elena, her willingness to speak candidly about his relationship with Sophie, both surprising and necessary. She didn't criticize his previous choices or lecture him about parental responsibility, but she helped him understand that Sophie's emotional needs weren't complex or demanding. His daughter simply wanted to feel seen, heard, and valued by the person whose opinion mattered most to her. The solution wasn't grand gestures or expensive gifts, but consistent presence, genuine interest, and the kind of everyday attention that communicated her importance in his life. Elena also shared observations about Sophie's resilience and capacity for forgiveness, insights that gave Marcus hope about the possibility of repairing their damaged connection. Children are remarkably forgiving, Elena explained, especially when they see genuine effort to change. Sophie hasn't given up on you, Mr. Wellington. She's been waiting, hoping, believing that someday you'd remember how to be her daddy again. The dance is just one opportunity to show her that wait wasn't in vain. Her words carried the weight of professional experience, but also the tenderness of someone who'd come to genuinely care about both father and daughter. The days leading up to the father-daughter dance became a crash course in reconnecting with his own child, Marcus approaching the challenge with the same methodical preparation he'd bring to any important business negotiation. He cleared his calendar completely for the weekend, ignoring Patricia's increasingly frantic messages about rescheduled meetings and delayed decisions. He researched the dance's format, purchased an appropriate dress for Sophie, and even practiced basic dance steps in his office during lunch breaks, determined not to embarrass his daughter with his rusty social skills. But more importantly, he began the delicate work of rebuilding trust through small, consistent gestures that demonstrated his renewed commitment to being present. Sophie's cautious optimism during this period was both heartening and heartbreaking. Her careful joy revealing how much she'd longed for this attention while simultaneously protecting herself from potential disappointment. She would light up when Marcus asked about her day, then seemed to catch herself, as if happiness might jinx this unexpected turn of events. When he offered to help with homework or suggested they watch a movie together, Sophie would agree eagerly, but with a vigilance that suggested she was prepared for interruption by more important obligations. Her reactions showed Marcus exactly how much damage his emotional absence had caused, while also revealing the depth of her desire to reconnect. Elena watched these tentative interactions with the kind of professional satisfaction that comes from seeing a family begin to heal, but also with personal investment that surprised Marcus with its intensity. He'd begun to recognize that Elena's care for Sophie went beyond professional obligation, her genuine affection for his daughter evident in countless small gestures and considerations. She'd created stability and warmth during a period when Marcus had been unable to provide either, filling gaps in Sophie's emotional life with the kind of maternal tenderness that had been missing since Victoria's death. The realization that Elena had essentially been co-parenting his daughter without acknowledgement or appreciation filled Marcus with both gratitude and shame. The evening of the father-daughter dance arrived with unexpected nerves on Marcus's part, his confidence in boardrooms not translating to elementary school social events where success was measured in his daughter's happiness rather than profit margins. Sophie had spent hours preparing with Elena's help, her navy blue dress perfectly fitted, hair arranged in the kind of elaborate style that communicated this was a special occasion. As Marcus watched Elena help Sophie with last-minute preparations, he was struck by the ease of their relationship, the way they moved around each other with the familiarity of family, and the genuine love that seemed to flow effortlessly between them. The Pemberton Academy Gymnasium had been transformed into a magical ballroom, complete with twinkling lights, elegant decorations, and a dance floor that beckoned fathers and daughters to create memories together. As Marcus and Sophie entered, hand in hand, he was immediately struck by the joy radiating from other father-daughter pairs, men who seemed completely comfortable in their roles as devoted dads, girls who glowed with confidence in their father's love. The contrast with his own uncertainty was stark, but Sophie's obvious pride at finally having her daddy attend a school event gave him courage to push through his discomfort. The evening unfolded with a series of small victories and gentle revelations. Marcus discovering that connecting with his daughter required less performance and more presence than he'd imagined. Sophie introduced him to her friends with obvious pride, her excitement at having him there infectious enough to ease his social anxiety. They danced to slow songs and fast ones, shared dessert from the buffet, and posed for pictures that would become treasured reminders of this turning point in their relationship. But the most meaningful moment came during a quiet song, when Sophie looked up at him with complete trust and whispered, "Thank you for coming, Daddy. This is the best night ever." The success of the dance created momentum for deeper changes in their family dynamic. Marcus beginning to understand that being a present father required fundamental shifts in priorities rather than minor schedule adjustments. He started leaving the office earlier, arriving home in time for dinner and bedtime routines that had become Elena's domain during his period of emotional absence. Weekend business calls were relegated to early mornings, preserving family time for activities that Sophie enjoyed. Most importantly, he began to really listen when Sophie talked, giving her his complete attention instead of the distracted acknowledgement that had characterized their recent interactions. Elena's role during this transition period was crucial, but increasingly complex, her position evolving from primary caregiver to something more like family consultant as Marcus reclaimed his place in Sophie's daily life. She offered guidance when he struggled with discipline issues, suggested activities that might interest Sophie, and provided continuity during his learning curve as a re-engaged parent. But Elena also began to step back gradually, recognizing that Sophie needed to rebuild her primary attachment to her father rather than maintaining her dependence on a surrogate maternal figure. This delicate dance required wisdom and selflessness that impressed Marcus deeply. The changes in Sophie were remarkable and swift, her personality blossoming as she began to trust that her father's attention was sustainable rather than temporary. Her academic performance improved, her behavior problems disappeared, and her general demeanor shifted from cautious to confident. She started bringing friends home after school again, proudly introducing them to her daddy, who was now available for conversation and snacks. Her artwork began featuring family pictures that included both her father and Elena, stick figures holding hands under rainbow skies that reminded Marcus painfully of the drawings he'd ignored during his period of emotional numbness. But perhaps the most significant change was in Marcus himself, the process of reconnecting with Sophie forcing him to confront the grief he'd been avoiding since Victoria's death. He'd convinced himself that burying his emotions in work was strength, that providing financially was sufficient expression of love, but his daughter's near loss had revealed the poverty of this approach. Elena's gentle wisdom and Sophie's forgiveness had created space for him to begin processing the pain he'd been carrying, to acknowledge that his withdrawal had been self-protection that had ultimately harmed the person he most wanted to protect. The conversation that would redefine their entire family dynamic began on a quiet Sunday morning in early spring, sunlight streaming through the kitchen windows as Elena prepared to leave after breakfast. Sophie was upstairs getting dressed for a play date, her chatter and laughter evidence of the emotional security she'd regained through her father's renewed attention. Marcus found himself reluctant to see Elena go, not just because of her competence with Sophie, but because her presence had become integral to the happiness their home had rediscovered. The realization that he'd begun to depend on Elena for more than professional childcare struck him with surprising force. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.